The morning the house went down, a yellow machine tore the low sky open, and dust swallowed the lane like a sudden tide. Wood and corrugated iron surrendered under iron teeth. A Singer sewing machine, black, nicked, its pedals still rusted in place, vanished under a cloud of plaster and memory. A voice rose above the din, thin and small. "Please, don't. This is all I have." It was Dona Laura. The camera kept rolling. On a cracked screen in a cramped kitchen 30 blocks away, Captain Sofia da Silva watched that 10 seconds of rubble and pleading, and something inside her unstitched. Beside her, Lieutenant Ana Lúcia gripped the phone as if it were the one lifeline she had left. The clip looped, the machine, the door falling, the shape of a woman pressed against a heap of dust. They did not need to know who had pushed the button on the excavator, to know what had been taken. "You thought you owned the town," Sofia said, not as a slogan, but as a fact that needed answering. "You didn't account for daughters." They rose at once. The phone was in Sofia's hand. The name saved to contacts read, "Pedro, neighbor." The footage had been shot from across the street, shaky, close enough to catch the color of the shirt, loud enough to carry the woman's voice. Pedro's thumbnail showed him in the doorway of a bar, a cigarette half burned. He was 22. He had been in the wrong place at a crucial time, and for that the world owed him nothing, except tonight, the truth. If this matters to you, tap like. It helps the story get seen. The footage spread with an economy that made no moral judgments. In the hours after it first hit the networks, strangers left comments invoking shame and lawyers. Neighbors relived the morning as if they had been there and not looked away sooner. For a town used to keeping its grudges private, the clip acted like a pinprick in a balloon. Air rushed out. Old bargains began to bruise. Dona Laura was a seamstress who mended hems the way other people mended fences, slowly, carefully, with hands that knew the language of fabric. Her Singer had outlived 2 husbands and 3 apprentices. It had fed and wrapped children, patched uniforms, stitched hospital sheets. When Sofia and Ana were small, their mother made their uniforms by hand. The girls learned to fold collars and count stitches. They learned the dignity of work and how a steady hand could hold a home together. Years later, both had sworn oaths in uniforms that were starched and new, and those pledges had always returned home to the woman who had taught them. Debt arrived like a quiet guest. Over months, what began as a loan to cover a bad harvest turned into a pressure that pressed and pressed until the margins of possibility thinned. The lender was unmistakable. Colonel Antonio Bastos, the town's leading landowner, a man with more influence than need.
He controlled contracts. He sponsored elections. He was often photographed at the promenade with a band of smiling men. He was also the man who lent and then leaned. Where law bent, Bastos often provided a convenient solution. Dona Laura paid when she could. She sold a pig here, a piece of land there. She patched payments with hours of sewing. The Singer was the last jewel she refused to pawn. When she refused it, Bastos moved like a predator circling a wounded animal. Notices were posted, then a summons. Warnings arrived in polite envelopes. On the morning the house went down, a truck with a municipal seal, color and number blurred by complicity, rolled up the lane. Men in jackets moved with the authority of municipal action. The machine moved with the inevitability of power. There was no legal thinness in what happened that morning, only if one accepted the right of some men to make law. To others, the morning read like theft in daylight. Sofia and Ana found Dona Laura wrapped in a blanket on the day she had nowhere to be, clinging to the one framed photograph she had not let them box. A faded portrait of the 3 of them on a beach the year before the uniforms, smiles young and unmarked. The photograph was intact, the Singer gone. At the police precinct, procedure should have felt mechanical and reliable. An officer takes a statement, a form is stamped, a case number is assigned. The girls filed a boletim de ocorrencia, a police report. They are officers, they know paperwork. They filled it numerically, inserted copies of the video, and asked for a patrol follow-up. They asked for a warrant to secure the site for evidence. What they expected was the small, predictable bureaucracy of a town that still functioned in public service. They did not imagine the ease with which a file could go cold. Delegado Silva wore civility as a suit. He had been in the office a long time, and that institutional longevity often softens the spine. When Sofia slid the USB drive across the desk, Pedro's original file, time-stamped and intact, Silva admired its plastic edge as if admiring a pen. He read the report with the quiet of someone who had lived for forms and for the calculation of risk. For every question the daughters asked, he found a neutral form of silence. "We'll register it," he said. "It will be investigated." The words were serviceable. Then the file went to a cabinet that smelled of coffee and exhaust, and the investigation did not begin. The complaint was archived with a bureaucratic calm that disguised deliberate closure. Delegado Silva crossed the room to a window and watched the street as if he were looking for a moment he could not name. Sofia and Anna watched him do that and felt, before the word formed, that they were being told something about the town's moral geometry. The center of gravity was not justice, it was influence. They did not accept that geometry. They were soldiers as much as daughters.
Military procedure gave them channels. They lodged a copy of the report with their command, they notified their superiors, and they prepared a chain of communication that would not be so easily rerouted into a drawer. There was a restraint in their anger. They would not be vigilantes. They would document, report, and call for accountability within the very systems designed to check abuses. Pedro handed over the original memory card without fuss. His hands shook more visibly when he spoke of what he had seen. A man with a face like a map of certainty. Men with municipal badges smiling as they directed the excavator. He had kept the clip because he did not trust oral memory to stand when power needed to speak. The clip, he said, was simple. It had shown what happened, and that was enough. Outside the precinct, Dona Marlene, the neighbor who had watched from her window, pressed a stained handkerchief to a mouth that refused to cry. Joaquin, who ran the small hardware shop at the corner, arrived with a list of neighbors who had faced similar pressure. 3 merchants who had their credit lines frozen after refusing to sell to Bastos's people, a farmer who woke to find his fences down, Dona Elsa, who had once been accused of selling land she did not own and had fought for years to prove it, now offered a name and a date she had filed a complaint, and a note saying it had gone nowhere. The town was a map of small wounds. This is where Julia Marquez entered the frame. Julia arrived in a rented car with a notebook and a clarity that comes from people who follow threads until they loosen a knot. A reporter who had worked regional beats, she knew what a small clip could do in a country with an appetite for justice-minded stories and a government that sometimes responded when the air pressure rose. She took copies of the video, copies of the stamped BO, the signed witness statements, and the cell phone of Pedro. She photographed the pile of charred boards and the empty concrete where the singer had stood. She asked the right questions with the bluntness of someone used to extracting clarity from evasive answers. Her reportage was method. She checked municipal records, found transfer deeds that carried Bastos's name, and noticed patterns in the formal complaints that point less to random stray injustices and more to a systematic web. She did not exaggerate. She did not need to. The facts, a bulldozed home, an archived complaint, a sequence of faded notices, formed a story that only needed telling. She promised to compile a dossier, the original footage on a secure pen drive, scanned copies of the BO, witness affidavits, a timeline of transfers and notices. That dossier, she said, would be an instrument. It would be shared with her editors, and it would be taken to institutional actors who could not afford to look away. Institutional actors moved at variable speeds. Captain Sofia understood that well.
Military channels promised an integrity that local reputation sometimes denied. She sent a formal report up the chain to her commanding officer, attaching a cover letter that mapped the evidence. She sent the pen drive. She expected, not certainty, but procedure, an acknowledgement, a record, a request for corroboration. The military did what it required. It logged, it instructed. It did not promise the immediate removal of anyone. It did, however, create a paper trail that could not be comfortably ignored by higher authorities. These were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of citizenship dressed in uniform. But in the interstices of paperwork, power moves. Bastos did not need to shout. His influence tended to compress and silt the water around it. A farmer's crate of produce disappeared from the market. A merchant learned his supplier no longer accepted his orders. A neighbor who had been warming the sewing machine in her kitchen woke to find a thin note slipped under her door. Quiet keeps towns safe. The note carried no signature, and that was the point. Fear need not be explicit to do its work. The colonel's allies convened in rooms that smelled of old tobacco and newer money. He listened, palms on the table, measuring the weight of public attention. A viral clip changes some things, he was told. It did not by itself guarantee outcomes. Delegado Silva, convenient in his avoidance, assured him that the investigation could be handled calmly. The investigators had time. Bastos smiled that slow smile of a man who had cultivated patience as an armor. The sisters moved methodically. They recorded witness statements and had those signatures witnessed and stamped. They photographed the destroyed plot. They made copies of municipal decrees and of past complaints found by Julia in the county office. They schemed within the strictures of procedure: who to call, which office to approach next, which newspaper had the reach to make a matter too large to be ignored. Their actions were firm, legal, and precise. When someone asked if they would accept an out-of-court agreement, they said no. The affront was not merely about money, it was about dignity, the dignity of an elderly woman whose home had been taken as easily as a shirt from a line. The network of witnesses grew, not explosively, but in a way that made complicity harder to maintain. Joachim gave a bank statement that matched an odd transfer. Dona Elsa signed an affidavit about a document she said had been altered. Peter, young and frightened, worked with Julia to create a secure copy of the original footage and to create a hash, the digital fingerprint, that would prove the clip's timestamp was authentic. Cyber-technical language entered the town's vocabulary: metadata, checksum, chain of custody. The neighbors learned new words, and through them a new power: proof. There were always limits.
The detectives in the neighboring jurisdiction could be called and would take statements. They might even issue a formal request for review. But legal processes do not gallop, they ambulate. The sisters understood that publicity could accelerate a process, but it could also provoke a backlash. The colonel's household had resources not measured only in money, but in leverage. It had friends in municipal administration and a comfort with encouraging amicable solutions that were, in practice, disarmingly effective. Silva's decision to archive the complaint made clear that one of the first fights would be bureaucratic. The girls attempted to force the record back into motion by delivering copies of their report to the Ministerio Público and to the Corregedoria of the military police, offices designed, in theory, to step in where local branches had become compromised. Julia offered to hold a press conference. She suggested a narrative that steered away from scandal and toward documented pattern. This was not an isolated act of cruelty, but part of a system where evidence mattered. In her notes, she connected dates and names. She did not draw conclusions the evidence could not support. Her discipline made the dossier hard to dismiss. Retaliation took shape in small things. The sisters discovered that someone had slashed the tires of Dona Marlene's old car. Someone threw a rock through Joaquim's shop window in the night. A man with no badge watched the daughters as they left the courthouse and drove slowly around the block twice. The messages were clear without language. Power would do what it had always done to protect itself. Sofia kept a list. She recorded license plates. She did not brandish anger. She logged it. On a legal pad, she wrote names and times and a sentence per event. She placed the notes in the folder destined for higher authority. The point was not to escalate without cause, but to create a record that could pierce the comfortable dullness of a town too used to small injustices. Julia's editor sketched an outline for a national piece, one that would not sensationalize but that would ask the right questions, the one Sofia and Anna had been pushing toward. Why had the complaint been archived? Who authorized the demolition? Which municipal orders carried signatures and which carried only the weight of influence? The editor wanted corroboration for every claim. He wanted dates, names, and documentary evidence, precisely what the sisters and the journalist had begun to assemble. If the piece ran, and if it ran with the proper rigor, it would place pressure on institutions to act. That by itself could change the calculus. Bastos called an informal meeting with local farmers and business owners. He reassured them with the same smile that had closed many deals. He could not let the town's image be rewritten by a handful of viral seconds. He began, subtly, to remind people of the costs of being disloyal.
Loyalty was a currency. It bought favors and quiet streets. Dissent was expensive. He spoke of order. He spoke of growth. He did not raise a hand. His influence reached farther than his voice. It was in the eerie quiet between the announcement of a forthcoming report and any actual action from the Corregedoria that the town felt the first true crack. Social sharing multiplied the clip until the story reached the morning shows. Calls came into the municipal office from people who had never heard of Dona Laura. Producers wanted interviews. Someone in a distant newsroom said, "We'll send a camera." The optics of publicity matter. The colonel's network could handle local quiet. National attention was a different animal. As paperwork moved between jurisdictional desks, a stamped copy from the precinct, an official acknowledgement from the command, an email to the Ministerio Público, the sisters kept watching the town. They scheduled meetings with the municipal attorney. They delivered the pen drive to a secure server, then left a copy with Julia for archival. They had photographs: the empty floor where the singer had stood, the circle of dust in the yard, the footprint of the excavator's treads. They carried with them the sound of Dona Laura's voice. Night descended. An unmarked truck idled at the corner. Pedro no longer smoked at the bar. He sat quietly with his hands folded. Joachim wiped his shop counter until the rag frayed. Dona Elsa kept her curtains closed. The town had always balanced on a toothpick between courage and fear. Now, under the weight of evidence, the toothpick creaked. Inside the colonel's compound, Bastos watched reports that showed trending metrics and comments. He saw the growth of the dossier's reach as something that required a measured response. He called Delegado Silva, and they spoke of managing the narrative. Delegado Silva, having lodged the complaint away, expressed irritation rather than alarm. The two men moved within a familiar choreography: power, patience, and the curation of outcomes. The sisters, by contrast, moved within a choreography of law. They would not let this be only a neighborhood quarrel. They took their next steps with disciplined escalation: copies to the Corregidoria, formal requests for review, a hand-delivered dossier to Major Validades of the military police, not as an act of provocation but as duty. Major Validades, a figure whose authority had the virtue of distance from local ties, acknowledged receipt. He asked for time to consult. The daughters knew that time might be the very commodity Bastos had spent years buying. They also knew that patience could become complicity. They did not pretend the outcome was inevitable. They had seen too often how archives became tombs. The sisters and the journalist worked to make the story too heavy to bury. In the days that followed, small stands of solidarity appeared. A neighbor left a patched pillow on Dona Laura's steps.
A group of retirees from the neighborhood association signed a brief note asking for a review. A printed photo of the singer sat in the window of a bakery. The town, in fragmented ways, remembered what dignity looked like. But power could still move its pawns. A municipal inspector signed a permit that, on paper, justified the demolition as public order. The document's language had legalese enough to confuse and thin the outrage for those who relied on official forms for solace. Not everything that looks bureaucratic is just. Not every stamped paper demands moral acquiescence. When the first television team arrived, Bastos's people were ready with an alternate narrative: technical enforcement, municipal regulation, the unfortunate necessity of urban renewal. They offered interviews with men who spoke calmly about process. They did not, in these pieces, show the footage of a woman begging as her home disappeared. The footage could not be erased from the internet. It could only be contextualized. The sisters did not speak to cameras and sound bites. They filed, they responded to subpoenas for statements, and they prepared for the long fight. They taught the town a new verb: to document. They collected signatures and assembled affidavits. Each piece fed into a bundle that Julia labeled evidence. Photographs, timestamps, signed witness statements, a verified copy of Pedro's footage on a secure pen drive, the stamped BO from the precinct, the email chain with commanding officers, all of it sat together in a blue folder. That folder would be held up later, not as a trophy, but as proof that truth can be corralled into a form that institutions find hard to deny. And yet, the colonel's patience was temperamental. On a late afternoon, when the light took the town's facades and turned them copper, a man in a jacket approached the family where Dona Laura had been given shelter. He left a card with a cookie-cutter apology and an offer to resolve matters quietly. The card had no signature. The gesture contained both an offer and a threat. Accept a settlement, and the town's machine would spin in comfortable ways. Refuse, and the machine would cast longer shadows. Sofia folded the card into her palm and did not burn it. She put it in the blue folder instead. At the edge of town, friends and neighbors met quietly. They spoke of courage as if it were a contagious thing. They promised to testify, to sign, to stand. They were not all soldiers or journalists. They were people who had watched a woman's house fall and had found, finally, a reason not to look down the road for salvation. They had found evidence. Evidence keeps a story from collapsing into rumor. Night before the Corregidoria's delegation was due to arrive, a convoy of heavy vehicles rolled into the adjacent county road. The town watched them with the same mixture of curiosity and dread reserved for storms. Voices circulated rumors.
Bastos's men did not announce their purpose. They were there, and their presence registered on the list of things that had once been taken for granted. Inside Dona Laura's temporary shelter, the daughters sat with her and opened a tin of tea. They spoke softly about mundane things: the pattern they might sew in the singer if it were repaired, the bread they would buy there with a hand at the hem.
They took the singer, she said, but they did not take the knowing. It is a small kind of prayer, that sentence. Dignity with very little fanfare. The morning the external auditor's van was scheduled to arrive, a low hum went through the town. The daughters prepared the files. Julia printed a preliminary piece to take to the producer in the city, one that would not sensationalize, but that would name names and document patterns. The producers loved a clear narrative: victim, visible abuse, systemic enablers. The city wanted proof. The proof sat in the blue folder. No one promised a neat end. No lawyer whispered guarantees. What moved in the air was possibility, not certainty. The colonel still had allies. Delegado Silva's archive remained a hard fact, but a new force had appeared in the town's calculus, proof in the hand of those who refused to be silent. On the day the corregidoria was meant to land, the phone on Sofia's kitchen table rang. The voice at the other end was flat, professional. A request for patience was couched in bureaucratic caution. Investigations take time. They cannot be rushed, but the file had been received. The daughters listened. They recorded the call. Across town, a truck idled in a shadow. Someone watched the house where everything began. The blue folder rested on a table. The pen drive lay in Sofia's pocket like an anchor. The fight, even when framed by law, had a pulse. It moved in the tempo of human beings. Slow when justice checked its pace. Fast when courage outran caution. The daughters had chosen to move on the side of law and evidence. Bastos had chosen to move on the side of influence and intimidation. The town held its breath between those rhythms. In the next day, the sisters planned to take the dossier to Major Valadares and to the Ministerio Público. Julia prepared to publish an introductory report that would frame the facts with documents and testaments rather than emotion. Pedro agreed to give a recorded statement before camera crew. The list grew. Witnesses were ready to sign. Invoices and transfer records were lined up. The proof of Sahin, the original clip, had been hashed and duplicated for secure storage. But at dusk, a black notice slid under the door of Dona Laura's shelter. It was a single line, typed. Some stones weigh more than others. No signature. The sentence had no demand.
It had the subtlety of a threat that does not need to demand. Sofia read it, folded the paper twice, and put it into the blue folder with the card and the tire receipts and the stamped BO. She understood the message's place in the wider strategy. She also understood that the folder, as an object, now served a purpose beyond paper. It was a public ledger of resistance. They would keep going. They would insist on the next link of accountability, even if it meant standing under pressure. The evidence would be the architecture of their argument. The public would be the amplifier. And yet, as night swallowed the town and the convoy's headlights blinked from the far road like a long-lidded stare, a different question waited in the dark. How far would the colonel go to defend a system that had served him so well? The dossier could topple a reputation. It could also, possibly, provoke a last, desperate play. Sofia thumbed the pen drive and thought of the singer, its iron body gone, but its shape kept in memory. The family would, in time, rebuild, but the rebuilding mattered only if the law could return a measure of dignity beyond mere brick. They had chosen procedure, proof, and publicity. They had chosen the slow geometry of justice over the quick arithmetic of revenge. Outside, someone murmured that a truck had left the compound. Inside, Dona Laura slept against the photograph. The blue folder waited on the table like a promise. The story would not conclude in a single thunder of arrest or in an instant of confession. It would proceed in chapters of testimony, in the patient assembling of proof, in the sometimes fragile courage of a community that learned to document rather than to ignore. The colonel recalibrated. The daughters kept their files open and their copies duplicated. Julia tightened her notes and prepared to place the story in the hands of a nation that could not claim ignorance. When the first official phone call came the next morning, a formal request for cooperation, it would arrive into a town that already knew the arithmetic of fear and the ledger of facts. The battle lines were ghosted in official documents and in the tight muscles of the people who would stand. Nothing was decided. Everything had shifted. The tape had turned into evidence, and evidence had become a public question. A corrupt detective had buried a complaint in a drawer. A woman had lost her house. A family had found a way to turn grief into procedure. The rest of the town watched, some with new courage, some with the quiet calculus of the compromised. The daughters readied themselves to deliver the folder to those whose offices carried the power to investigate. They also readied themselves for the weeks of pressure that would come with action. At the edge of town, an unmarked car rolled by slowly and then parked at a distance. A single man got out and walked toward the bakery window where the photo of the singer sap-taped to the glass.
He stood there for a long time and then left, as if he had seen enough. The town held its breath and waited for the institutions to answer the question the blue folder posed, whether proof, once visible, could force accountability where influence had once promised immunity. In the rooms where decisions were made, papers shuffled. In the houses where neighbors slept, curtains twitched. In the precinct where files had been convenient to archive, someone unlocked a drawer and took out a set of forms. The engine of justice, even when slow, had been started. It would make noises, it would sputter, it would demand fuel. The daughters, the journalist, and the neighbors had already stocked the first reserves: testimony, timestamps, signatures, and the stubborn insistence that dignity is not a commodity to be excavated by men with machines. They did not yet know if the Corregidoria would act with speed, or if the Ministerio Público would find the courage to file charges that stuck. They knew only that a complaint had been filed, archived, and resurrected, and that a town had learned to watch the way it treated its weakest among them. Outside, the last light clung to a roofline. The blue folder lay open, the pen drive like a small, glowing heart. The sisters locked the door to Dona Laura's shelter and left with the certitude of people who have placed their trust in process and in evidence. The night, for a little while, remained heavy with possibility. Dawn arrived like a promise and a summons. The convoy that had worried the town the night before came back in daylight, not in the opacity of headlamps now, but with official plating and an air of formality that people stepped out of doorways to watch. White vehicles, a van with the Corregidoria crest, military police in neat caps, and 2 vans marked for the Ministerio Público rolled up the main lane and stopped near the bar where Pedro used to stand. Cameras hovered at a distance. Julia's crew had already sent a short alert to the city editors. Teams on site, Corregidoria arriving. Sofia watched them from the window of Dona Laura's shelter with a steadiness that had been trained into her bones and sharpened by a week of sleepless nights. Her fingers tapped the side of her teacup the way a metronome counts not the music it keeps, but the time left to play. Ana Lúcia stood behind her. Both wore the quiet armor of people who had learned to let procedure lead. The blue folder lay open on the table between them like an accusation and a hope at once. Major Valadares arrived with a small team, officers from the military police who were not part of the town's payroll, auditors with folders of their own, and a young prosecutor whose badge glinted like a small, impatient sun. They stepped from their vehicles with the methodical calm of strangers who had been summoned to correct a town's internal map. They asked for the file. Sofia handed it over.
The pen drive felt like a small detonator in the major's hand. Outside the precinct, Delegado Silva watched the delegation approach, and for a moment his practiced civility wavered. The neat lines of his office could not hide the fact that a regional command had come to look into a drawer he had preferred remain closed. He rose, smoothed his jacket, and offered a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Inside his desk, the stamped BO sat the way it had sat since the day Sofia and Ana had filed it, marked legitimate, inconvenient. The Corregidoria officers did not ask for permission. They read warrants and signed confirmations. They moved with the kind of legal weight that unsteadied men who had ruled by habit rather than law. They took statements on the spot. They photographed the precinct's numbered files, and they copied the index entries. When one of them tapped the drawer where fees and sealed forms were kept, the air seemed to hold its breath. At the colonel's compound, Bastos watched the news feeds with a hand that steadied itself only in the act of pressing a glass to his lips. He had cultivated a network that bent easily in the direction of his voice. It was not the network he feared, it was the exposure. He had always been able to find the calm middle ground where trouble's edges smoothed into negotiation. This, he had not anticipated, was not going to be a negotiation. Orders came down with the crispness of a coordinated campaign. The Ministerial Public issued an urgent order to hold and inventory goods tied to the colonel's enterprises that might have been acquired under questionable circumstances. The military police, operating under Corregidoria oversight, prepared a formal simultaneous operation to ensure the chain of custody. It was an operation meant to stare the town's old geometry of influence in the face and declare, in quietly enforced terms, that paper and proof mattered. When they moved in, they found things that mattered. Files showed transfers that had been thinly documented. Municipal signatures that had appeared on demolition notices were compared against registry records and found to bear irregularities. Witness statements that had been tucked away in personal drawers were now corroborated by timestamps and digital copies. The original memory card that Pedro had handed to Julia was examined under forensic light. The hash she had created matched the encrypted copy on the folder, and the clip, that 10 seconds of a woman pleading while a machine ate her doorway, took on a new legal shape. It was no longer just a viral image. It became timestamp, evidence, and cause. Men who had once moved with the confidence of patrons found themselves asked to answer direct questions. The colonel's right-hand men shuffled. An office assistant in the municipal building who had signed off on the demolition permit claimed he had relied on instruction.
A municipal inspector admitted he had issued a form he later could not justify. Each murmur was recorded. Each hesitation was a crack. Delegado Silva tried to explain procedural norms. He offered a version where the complaint had been managed with professional care. The Corregidoria representative, a woman with a voice as plain as a ledger, listened and then read her own notes. "We are removing this file for review," she said. "You will be contacted for clarification." The phrasing was professional and left no room for old courtesies. Outside, a light crowd had gathered. Some watched with the fierce satisfaction of long-denied witnesses finally allowed to look straight into the face of what had scared them. Others kept their distance, fingers folded in cautious reserve. Pedro stood near the edge of the crowd and did not smoke. His eyes were fixed on the vans. His jaw was a hinge that did not loosen. When the first handcuffs were closed around Bastos's wrist, no one cheered. No banners rose. A small, practical cheer is not the town's language. Instead, people pulled their children off the curb and turned their faces away from a man who had seemed to own the horizon. Bastos folded into the constraint with the dignity of someone unaccustomed to being physically limited. He spoke only once, his voice low and sarcastic. "This is theatrics," he said. "They will leave by dinner." The words were a thin attempt at theater of his own. He was escorted to a van with the same procedural calm used earlier by others who had thought power a shelter. The colonel's arrest did not erase the archive that had once been his insurance. Complicity followed its own faint rules. Local officials who had smiled with his entourage now found themselves looking at subpoenas. Delegado Silva was not immediately handcuffed, but he was asked to accompany a team to clarify his archive. The Corregidoria's move was strategic: remove the figure who could still tilt the town's daily life, gather the files that might reveal patterns of favor, and create a record public enough to prevent easy reconciliation. There were moments of electricity. At one point, a defense lawyer arrived and tried to argue procedural fault. He spoke of technicalities and jurisdiction. The prosecutor listened and then, in a quiet, precise voice, said that the public interest required immediate preservation of evidence. The argument tightened and thinned, and the law proceeded. Legal argument in that hour could not hide behind the kinds of favors power had once quietly paid for. Across the country, Julia's piece had run. It was not a sensational hit so much as a piece of journalism that made inconvenient facts plain. The report braided the clip, the archived complaint, and the municipal papers into a narrative that asked questions institutions had found difficult to hear in the small lanes of the town.
Calls came into the office of the Ministerio Público from city councils, from curious prosecutors, and from unions that demanded quick audits. The amplifier of media had turned local evidence into a national question, and national attention changed the calculation of safety for those who had once believed silence was the only option. Retaliation that had been small then sharpened. A night after the arrests, someone tried to burn the little shelter where Dona Laura had been sleeping. The fire was quick to catch, but quicker still to be put out by neighbors with buckets and a ladder. The note shoved under the door 2 nights before, "Some stones weigh more than others," now felt like the echo of what might have been. The town, which had learned to hide small cruelties behind polite shoulders, now learned how to stand in the sudden heat of open danger. The daughters had expected intimidation. The community had expected to be afraid. The forging of public attention and legal presence kept the flames from becoming a conflagration. Inside a temporary command post set up in a municipal hall, the prosecutor and Major Valadares went through evidence with a kind of austere choreography. They cross-referenced bank transfers, land deeds, and municipal permits. Names that had floated in the town's gossip column now became indexed facts. The proof the sisters had assembled, signatures, timestamps, scanned BOs, allowed the prosecutor to present a robust case to a judge. What had started as a buried complaint unfolded into a dossier that could not be dismissed by a casual signature in a drawer. The legal process, as it had been throughout, did not move like lightning. It moved like a river through legislation and hearings. Indictments were drafted. Investigations of public officials, including the municipal officer who signed the demolition permit, were opened and administrative measures were taken. Delegado Silva was suspended pending inquiry. A mayoral aide whose name had come up in discussions of patronage was called in for clarification. The town watched, some with hope, some with the wary skepticism of people who had seen investigations stall. Assets were provisionally frozen. The Ministerial Público requested and obtained orders to inventory certain properties owned by Bastos. The procedural language here is important. These were precautionary measures taken to preserve the possibility of reparations, not final judgments of guilt. Still, the fiscal pressure mattered. Investments were halted, contracts were reviewed, and public works that had flowed through certain channels now required oversight. Power that had been exercised through many small channels of favor found financial gears grinding.
As the case wound through magistrates, the sisters continued to do what they had always done, document. More witnesses came forward. Joachim, the hardware shop owner, gave a detailed ledger showing anomalous transactions.
Dona Elsa provided a photocopy of a deed that contradicted what had been presented in municipal records. Pedro testified on camera, his voice steady as a line of stitches. He described the scene he had filmed and why he had saved the clip. His testimony carried the simple, unglamorous weight of someone who had done what little courage had allowed. The court set dates. The first hearing was procedural. The second reached into the town's memory. Public defenders and private attorneys spoke in measured legalese. The prosecutor relied on the blue folder's contents, but also on the way the town's daily life had been hollowed out by quiet pressure. The case was not only about a single house going down. It was about the architecture of influence that had permitted houses to be demolished with municipal paperwork and a murmur. Outside the courthouse, people left notes and photos. A small group organized a repair fund. Others offered labor. The reconstruction of Dona Laura's house became to the town a public project at once practical and symbolic. The legal system had to show it could return more than just a headline. It had to enact a measure of restitution. Legal resolutions arrived in stages. Some charges were criminal in form: demolition without due cause, abuse of authority in permitting, coercion in relation to municipal processes. Others were administrative: improper authorizations, failure to preserve citizen rights. The initial judgments required clarification. Assets were to be assessed, provisional measures put into place, and victims to be considered for compensation. The language in the court transcripts was careful, and the town read it slowly, as if parsing a text that might deliver them, at last, a practical restoration. When the assets affiliated with Bastos' enterprises were listed for inventory, the public felt the friction of old scales tilting. Inventory does not equal redistribution. It is an accounting step. But it mattered because it allowed, eventually, a public sale, a leilong, whose proceeds, after legal costs and rightful claims, could be directed to reparations. The prosecutor sought to use part of any recovered funds to compensate victims like Dona Laura. The argument was legal and moral in the same breath. When power appropriates public trust, it should not be permitted to walk away with the spoils. The rebuilding of the house was a practice in public solidarity. Materials were donated, carpenters volunteered, and Joachim provided a ledger viscount and a stack of lumber. An architect who had been following the story off-duty offered a plan that made efficient use of what funds were available. The town pitched in not out of charity alone, but because the act of rebuilding was an intentional repudiation of the idea that some lives could be taken without consequence. Restoration is never only bricks. It was in the hands that lifted beams, in the food that arrived on a hot afternoon, in the neighbor who painted a wall 2 shades brighter than originally planned because it needs to look alive. It was in the arrival of a donated singer, a machine bought by a collective of citizens who had watched the original vanish, and in the quiet, meticulous labor of a mechanic who coaxed the old black iron back to hum. The machine was not the exact one that had been swallowed. The original was found, much later, in a storage shed tied to one of the colonel's enterprises, and returned as part of the inventory. It bore rust and a crooked pedal, but its plate, its curved name, the ghostly shape of its work remained. The mechanic cleaned, polished, and mended. A new belt was spliced. A bright piece of thread marked the first stitch sewn in the rebuilt home. The day Dona Laura sat at the singer again, the town did not stage a parade. They did not need to. The sound of the machine was alone enough, a small mechanical rhythm that meant income, continuity, and the return of a life's tools. Sofia watched her mother begin a seam as if watching a prayer take its auditory form. Lúcia stood by the doorway and let the light spell itself across the wooden floor. Tears came without fanfare. The dignity of labor, when restored, is not a spectacle, it is a steadying thing. Legal victories and administrative measures continue to be measured. Bastos was charged with multiple counts related to misuse of influence and improper demolition practices. The trial that followed would be long and contested. Public assets linked to irregular processes were listed for sale, and part of the proceeds were earmarked by court order to compensate victims. Delegado Silva was removed from his post and referred for disciplinary proceedings. The municipal inspector who had signed the demolition permit was suspended pending review. Names that had once circulated in whispers were now on official lists. The town's old arrangements had been, at least partially, exposed to daylight and to law's slow, patient machine. A few things always remained unresolved. Not every harm is fully repairable in court. Some relationships, once altered by fear, will never exactly return to what they were. People who had collaborated, whether by omission or action, found themselves judged by neighbors in ways that no legal ruling could sweeten. The daughters knew this and never promised a clean end. What they sought, with the rigor that had carried them so far, was a restoration of dignity and a proof that institutions could, under pressure and with careful evidence, act. The town learned to value the public ledger. The blue folder was not a talisman but a tool. It was copied, filed, and archived in multiple places. Pedro gave his recorded statement to the prosecutor and to Julia. He returned to the bar, but he no longer smoked in the doorway the way he had before.
Joaquim rebuilt a side of his shop and put the ledger in a new sealed box labeled Community Account. Dona Marlene knitted and gave away small bundles of scarves. People who had been quiet found themselves in witness boxes, their voices steadying into public testimony. The final day of the trial, months on, was not a cinematic thunder. It was the careful reading of a verdict that ordered restitution and the confiscation of certain assets tied to irregularities. The court found guilt in the destruction of property without due process and in actions that exploited municipal channels. The language of the verdict was careful to note both culpability and the institutional failures that had allowed the conduct to occur. Sentences were handed down in the manner the law prescribes: punitive, calibrated, and accompanied by orders for compensatory measures. The court's ruling did not pretend to be a panacea. It offered instead accountability where there had long been an architecture for avoidance. When the auction of confiscated goods took place, the leilong the prosecutor had described as a means to provide funds for reparations, there was a long line of citizens with small handwritten slips and a few institutional buyers obliged by law. A portion of the proceeds went to a public fund for victim compensation. Another portion was dedicated to strengthening municipal controls to prevent similar abuses. A small remnant paid legal costs. For Dona Laura, the essential use of the funds was not only monetary. There was the return, at last, of a public gesture. The town would not simply look away. After the formalities, the town's routine came back softened by memory. Markets opened, children returned to school, and neighbors resumed the small courtesies that had once been mistaken for stability. The daughters continued their service, their ranks unchanged, but their presence in town was different now. They were not only officers, they were the ones who had used the law as a kind of shield. People approached them with gratitude, and sometimes with new questions about how to secure their own rights. The sisters answered with a firmness that had become calm through trial. Document, report, keep evidence. They meant it as civic instruction as much as warning. Julia wrote a follow-up piece that did not celebrate triumph so much as cataloged the town's exercises in accountability. She included quotes about the social costs of silence, the cost of evidence, and the necessity of public attention. Her piece did not offer platitudes. It offered an account of what had been necessary for institutions to act: documentation, persistent reporting, and the willingness of citizens to speak. The national peace had, in a sense, served its function. It had turned local disturbance into a conversation about how small towns could reinstate a baseline of justice. The singer, repaired and humming, stitched a new hem on a uniform. It stitched hospital shrouds.
It sewed a little quilt that the neighbors gave to Dona Laura as a thank you for the steadfastness she had shown through the oddest of losses. At night, she sat in the patched doorway of her rebuilt house and watched the lane like someone who had become familiar with the rhythm of watchful grace. "They took more than a house," she said once to Sofia, "but the house is not everything." The sentence was small and true. The house had been a symbol and a livelihood. Its return was practical. Its meaning was larger. In the weeks that followed, the town continued to practice the discipline the daughters had introduced: recording, filing, corroborating. A local council passed modest reforms to require additional oversight on demolitions, a small municipal change that would not stop corruption everywhere, but would at least add checks to a process that had been too easily manipulated. A civic committee formed to help elders access legal counsel when facing financial pressure. The reforms were not perfect. They were, however, a deliberate attempt to build public architecture that made the old habits harder to reproduce. The colonel, now a figure whose name had been written on many legal sheets, learned the difference between local authority and legal accountability. He had expected influence to be a kind of permanent horizon. The court's process and the public attention showed him otherwise. He left the town under conditions the law prescribed, shorn of the ease with which he had once moved. Delegado Silva, in administrative hearings, faced questions about the ethics of his long tenure. He answered in the language of procedural caution, but answers are not the same as absolution.
The sisters did not become heroes in the narrow sense of storybook myth. They were officers who did their duty in a place where duty required persistence beyond rank. Their action was not the result of a single furious night, but the product of method. They kept records, they reported to proper channels, and they refused out-of-court placations. In moments when someone suggested they had taken matters into their own hands, they corrected the narrative with the precise, patient language of procedure. We reported, we documented, we delivered the evidence. That insistence mattered because it framed the victory as one of institutions, corrected, pressured, and forced into action, not as the triumph of private retaliation. People who watched from far away learned a lesson about the power of visual evidence. The clip Pedro shot had been the initial pinprick. It made possible the sequence that followed. It reminded the town and anyone who looked at the story that when someone decides to record and preserve truth, the simplest artifact, a video on a small memory card, can become an instrument of accountability. Evidence creates the possibility of justice, but it does not guarantee it. The sisters knew that.
They had raised the stakes and then stayed at their posts to see whether the institutions would finally act. In the rebuilt home, Dona Laura laid a small piece of cloth with a pattern she had sewn in the week after the demolition. It was a simple square with a stitched border, a thing made out of necessity and with a patient hand. When strangers came by to see the house after it was painted and its windows installed, she handed them a small square. "Take this," she said, "so you remember what hands do." It was an ordinary, tender thing. People took the squares, and they kept them. Months later, the town's calendar contained the story in its bones. People spoke differently, and not because they had become less afraid, fear had not dissolved, but because they had learned to build records, to insist on procedure, and to call in higher authority when the local geometry of influence threatened to swallow a life. A small committee of citizens met weekly to help elders with documents. The municipal archive was reorganized. A teacher started teaching civic literacy in the school, using a pared-down version of events to show children how evidence and institutions fit together. The final image of the story is not an image of punishment alone. It is a domestic one, a photograph of 3 women, a mother and her daughters, at a kitchen table, a singer between them humming a steady rhythm. The light catches the curve of the singer's plate. Their hands move with patient precision. Around them, neighbors pass in and out. The house has a small porch with a white chair. A child runs past with a kite. The town keeps its pulse with small actions rather than grand declarations. There remains the broader lesson. Power can be challenged not only by anger, but by persistent adherence to law and evidence. Institutions may sleep or ignore. They may be complicit at first, but presented with solid proof, properly documented and carried up the chain, those institutions, when they function as designed under public pressure, can act. The process is never instantaneous. It is sometimes lacking. It is, however, possible. Sofia and Anna did what daughters and officers do when their roles intersect. They protected, they documented, and they insisted on lawful action. They trusted the instruments of accountability, even when those same instruments had at first been compromised. Their example carried the complicated truth that courage in a small town often looks like method, patience, and the refusal to accept easy settlements for wrongs done. On an ordinary afternoon, as the town resumed its routines with a new seam of attention, Julia filed an afterword for her original report. She closed with a sentence that did not triumphalize but invited continued care. When the quiet is broken by evidence, institutions must answer. Otherwise, the quiet will always belong to those who benefit.
The line traveled slowly through social feeds, picked up by small civic groups, quoted at a local council meeting, and repeated by a school teacher who taught evidence gathering to teenagers as civic practice. Dona Laura Singer stitched the first uniform under the new municipal oversight that required additional signatures for demolition work. It was a small irony that a uniform sewn on the same machine used to stitch a citizen's life back together would later be the garment worn by a municipal inspector required to sign with an aware hand. The irony was not of fate, it was of ordinary consequence. If the narrative holds a final moral, it is this: not all fights are won by single acts of heroism. Some are won by accumulation, small acts of record-keeping, of reporting, of neighborly testimony, and by the willingness to press an institutional lever until it begins to creak. The sisters knew this. They appealed to systems that sometimes move slowly, but they kept their files open and their copies secured. They did not rely on vengeance. They relied on law, on journalism, and on the courage of a community that turned evidence into pressure. Months later, as the town remembered the long arc of events, someone taped a small printed card in the bakery window. On it was a photograph of the singer and the simple words, "Dignity stitched back." The card was not a boast. It was a reminder.
If this story has any request of those who hear it, it is modest. Watch, record, and speak for what you see. Evidence has weight. Institutions answer when the public makes them hard to ignore. And when institutions finally act, keep asking for the kind of repair that returns dignity, not only money. Share this story so injustice like Dona Laura's can hide. If you want to follow more stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications for updates.